Right. This video is going to talk about how the equilibrium in the model of supply and demand changes when there is a shift in either the demand curve or the supply curve. And in this case, I'm going to actually look at the case of an increase in demand. This is an example of what we call comparative statics. What we're going to do is we're going to compare the equilibrium before the event with the equilibrium after the event. The change in the equilibrium, as you compare the two equilibria, is what we will use as our way to be able to attribute changes or events that have happened in the market to the shift in demand. So I've got the diagram drawn up here with a demand curve and a supply curve, and we've got the equilibrium drawn in this case. So the last video I put up was showing the equilibrium in the model of supply and demand. So this is basically jumping off where we ended there, knowing that equilibrium is that the price for quantity supplied equals quantity demanded. They intersect here. So P1 would be the equilibrium price, and Q1, the quantity at that point, would be the equilibrium quantity. And I've labeled those P1 and Q1 because we're going to have a second one after the shift. So we're going to compare P1 with P2 and Q1 with Q2. We're going to have the case I'm going to look at here is an increase in demand. So the best way to think about an increase in demand or an increase in supply is a shift to the right of the curve. So I've got D1 drawn in here, and this would be the demand curve, say, for potato chips, the good I have drawn up here now. This would be the demand curve for potato chips initially. Now, anything that could have happened to cause an increase in demand would be what we'd be drawing here. So something like an increase in the price of a substitute good, like say cheese corn. So if the price of cheese corn goes up, then people might want to shift and eat potato chips instead of cheese corn. So we could see an increase for that reason. If potato chips are a normal good, we could have an increase in demand. So in chapter 3, when they go through all of the different things that might shift demand, anything that leads to an increase in demand would be what we'd have going on here. So the first thing I have to do is draw an increase in demand. So here's D1, an increase in demand shifts the demand curve to the right. I have to draw a second demand curve. I'll do that here. And there is D2. So that's the demand curve after the shift. Now, if we want to think about this model very literally, just as like we said, and talk about how you get to equilibrium initially, we might imagine if this is the quantity of potato chips, this model, remember, has to have some time period in place. So maybe this is the weekly, the market for potato chips weekly. When we were first talking about equilibrium in this model, I might say if we start with demand of D1 and the supply curve, the price might not immediately, if you think about it, literally if we're looking at a market, the price might not immediately be P1, but P1 is our best guess as to like what the price would tend to in this market. And then once it got there, it would stay there in terms of the plans of buyers and sellers coordinate. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to compare the equilibrium before and after. So if you wanted to think about what literally would be taking place here, is there would have to be an adjustment process that would be going on. We're not going to worry about the adjustment process. We're going to compare what the equilibrium would be in the market when the demand curve is D1 with the equilibrium in the market when the demand curve is D2. So to find the equilibrium in the market with demand curve D2, well, we could do that just as if what we would have done here initially before we had D1. We have a demand curve and supply curve. Equilibrium would be the price at which the quantity demand equals quantity supplied, or where the demand and supply curves intersect. That's here. So the price with demand curve D2 has to be that price. So there's P2. And then the quantity would be the quantity at that amount, and that would be Q1, or Q2, sorry, Q2. So we have P2 and Q2, that's our equilibrium after the increase in demand. Now, one way to think of this as equilibrium, and why what we had as an equilibrium before is no longer going to work as an equilibrium in this model, is that with D2 at a price of P1, the quantity supplied is still Q1. That's off the supply curve there. But at P1, the quantity demanded, well, we have to go over to D2 and we see that the quantity demanded would be somewhere over here to the right of Q2. The quantity demanded at P1 is greater than the quantity supply. So P1, which was the price in the equilibrium price with demand curve D1, is no longer going to work as an equilibrium. And as we said before, when we were talking about explaining the equilibrium, the model of supply and demand, if the quantity demanded is greater than the quantity supplied, that's what's called a shortage in the market, and there's going to be upward pressure on the price. So if immediately after the shift of the demand curve from D1 to D2, the price remains P1, what was the price in this market, we can see given the increase in demand, there's now a shortage in this market. People would want to buy more potato chips than are actually available at the price of P1. That creates upward pressure on the price, just as we talked about before. And not everybody who wants potato chips at the price are able to. They're selling off the shelves. Suppliers, store owners will see this. They'll say, like, hey, we're selling out potato chips every week. We could probably order some more in. And they'd be willing to order some more in if they raise the price. So there's upward pressure on the price. That's what's going to happen. We're going to get to a new equilibrium at P2. So we're going to compare the equilibrium now. We'll see that. One thing, and again, comparing here, we will see that the price has increased and the quantity has increased. That's very straightforward, just looking at this, but P1, P2 is greater than P1, and Q2 is bigger than Q1. So we can see that in the equilibrium with the increase in demand, the price will have increased and the quantity will have increased. Now, that would also be a testable prediction of this model of supply and demand. If there is something that's going to lead to an increase in demand, we should expect to see, everything else held equal in the market, to see that the price would be higher and that the quantity would be larger. So if you want to think about like the demand for beach rentals on the Florida Gulf Coast is going to be higher in July than it would be in January. And we can explain that. We can explain that, people just rather go to the beach in the summer when it's hot than in January. So that would be when we compare, the demand for condos and other rental property on the beach in Destin, Florida, we'd say that, well, in July, the demand would be higher than the demand in January. So we would expect to see a higher price and a larger quantity of the good available. And that's sort of what we see, right? Rents are higher. If you want to rent a place on the beach, there's off-season rates that are lower. So when the demand is lower, there's the lower rates. And some condos in some rental places will board up entirely, go off the market. There'll be seasonal rentals. So that again will be reflected here in the change in the quantity. And so in any of these cases where we're talking about an increase in demand or a decrease in demand, an increase in supply or a decrease in supply, we do comparative statics. We compare the equilibrium before and after, and these are all giving us testable predictions. And there's been a lot of testing of this over the decades and a lot of evidence showing that the price changes occur like this, as we expect. And it also means that shifts in demand and supply give us a first way to try to help make sense of things that we see out there in the world. That what's happening to prices in the world is no longer has to be a mystery. You can probably explain it down into something in terms of a shift in demand or a shift in supply. So this is how we do the analysis. I made this video to show an increase in demand. The cases of an increase in supply or decrease in supply or decrease in demand are pretty similar. You're just, again, going to compare the equilibrium in each case. And in the book, they go through and sum that up. So I did one video for showing a effect of a change in demand and supply. And this would be the one of the increase in demand, but the other ones are relatively similar. So that's the comparative statics and the supply and demand model.